life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Hopefully, all of these ideas, these sounds, what I just said resonates with all of you, especially those of you that are living here in the United States. But if they're not, it's pretty poignant words that came directly from our Declaration of Independence. That combined with hard work, national pride, and right to privacy, which is, as we'll talk about, not exactly a right, are all things that I think in today's day and age are being encroached on. And my hypothesis that we're going to test out today, talk about, and hopefully I get to hear about from you guys on how you feel about it. But my hypothesis is that in ignoring these founding principles of our country in America, in kind of pushing these to the side for, whether it be short-term gain, a feeling of security, a feeling of safety, we're actually denigrating what it means to be American. And we're also putting to the side what I think most of us kind of all feel deep in our heart of hearts, that this country is not what it used to be. For all this talk and some talk on integrating some of the modern day examples that I have for us, we're going to get into it. I am your host. This is Sal Assante, and we are the We The Patriots Podcast. And I can't wait to get into it with you guys today. So let's go. So what I have for you guys. So today, this is actually kind of sparked. I had this idea that I wanted to do this show that wasn't really entirely tied in, if at all tied into the current events, but a certain current event actually came across my X feed, my Twitter feed this morning. And yeah, I was a little bit sickened. If you've been listening to the show enough, I think you know pretty well that I am just as critical, if not more critical, of President Trump than I am of anybody. I don't care who's in office. You should be upholding the American values, the truths of what it means to be an American. And I don't care what side you come from. If anything, I see myself a little bit as an independently minded American, and I think a lot of us really are. And it's sad to see the state that our nation is currently in from my perspective. So I kind of want to dive into that again. As you heard there in the intro, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, how all of this is kind of integrated and certain rights that were kind of thrown out the window. First and foremost, I think the limited government thing is something that is at least on the top of my mind a lot nowadays. I spoke a little bit about it last week with the Big Beautiful Bill. I know I threw that out on Memorial Day. So if you didn't get to see that show, go ahead and take a listen. I thought it was decent at best. Pretty good show. If you don't care, then continue to watch this. But in my explanation of what the Big Beautiful Bill was, and I think it's more of a big, beautiful disaster, we saw another expansion in government spending, a proposal to raise the debt ceiling again, and just really no hard cutout action in order to reduce the spending at the federal level, state level, really at all. And it's disappointing to me. I know that what a lot of people voted for with Trump was a stop, an end to the endless spending, an end to the constant climbing in debt that America seems to be in right now. And it's not stopping. Like I said, with the Constitution, we have a few pretty obvious areas that are supposed to be focused on by the federal government. And that would be overseeing commerce, defense, but almost everything else, especially with regards to the 10th Amendment, was supposed to be left to the states to govern internally. Now, I think with certain things, I'm making a very obvious claim there, but if you don't know what I'm referencing, when you're talking about something like slavery, with slavery being governed by the states and being a decision that the original Congress did not want to get into for the fear of not having a altogether union to fight against Britain, they left the argument of slavery out. Many of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson included, who was a huge part of putting together a constitution, wrote it. I think that they knew that there was a contradiction there, that they were fighting for the rights of man, for all men who all men are created equal. However, we're going to throw out the rights of the slaves that even he himself owned and many of the founders owned. And it was pointed out in Federalist 45, written by James Madison, that the federal powers are few and defined. what I think was getting at there was that there is a cherished part of the American past that is supposed to be put into local governance hand, whether you're at the level of state or more than likely what he was referring to was even more local politics, talking about by town, by city, by township, things like this. And now at this point, so many things are escalated to the federal level, either to take away from the ability to make a decision, have it backfire, I think, at the local level, or maybe in a different way as well, in order to kind of broaden the scope of what policy and policy enforcement actually means. Now, what the thought, of course, with limiting government in the first place was to try to foster some sort of self-reliance and push for hard work and dedication to the united cause in order to have a fabric as a nation. And I think getting away from that again is kind of tearing away at that fabric of the nation. And another thing that you can look at is, of course, the spending of the federal government. You're looking back on the year of 1800, which is so long ago, but for comparison's sake, federal spending was something like 2% of the GDP. And all the way up to today, we're looking at something like $6.8 trillion of spending at the federal level. So instead of 2% of the GDP, we're looking now at almost a quarter, about 24% of the GDP. Now, a lot of that is driven by mandatory programs, or mandatory as our government sees it. So Social Security, Medicare, a lot of what I've railed against for quite some time. But these make up a giant amount of our budget, somewhere around 60%, and the debt interest is climbing. The payments that we're making on that, I believe, are actually exceeding what we're spending on defense, which is incredible, especially as we're looking at what Donald Trump is proposing to spend. I think it's over $1.2 trillion that he's looking to spend yearly on defense. It's astronomical. It is huge. But what we've reached with our national debt level being somewhere around $34 trillion is that we've actually gone well over 100% of our GDP is now in debt. That is not a great sign, as I've talked about in the past. Now, they have changed what the definition would be in many previous cases. That might be a way of deciding whether a country is on the road to hyperinflation, would be if their debt has surpassed their GDP in terms of a percentage basis. And now they've moved that on. So many of the, as we'll call, first world countries, first rate powers in the world are above 100% of their GDP in debt. And so they had to make a new definition. I don't think that's a great way of running things. And part of that spending, of course, is just the scope of the government. You think about programs like Department of Education, as we talked about with good friend John that came on the podcast recently, John Marshall. You talk about the EPA, the DHS. Talk about all these different programs that have been enacted really in the past 50 years. And it's really not hard to see why our spending has gone up so tremendously and really exponentially over the past really 20 years that we've blown out the spending. Now, what you would point to in order to recognize what expansion of government and how these programs came about, well, you could point to some pretty broad sweeping legislation. One, of course, being the New Deal that was struck in response to the Great Depression by FDR. That was in the 1930s. You look at the Great Society in the 1960s, and I think what a lot of us, especially more recently, are paying attention to is the Patriot Act that was in 2001. All of these expanded what federal government was supposed to be overseeing, expanded the spending, of course, because you had so many more programs that had to be funded by federal government. And the biggest issue that I think, if you're comparing to what having a small and localized government was supposed to do, it bypasses what the states are actually supposed to be governing. And it takes away state's ability to govern itself. It is truly, I think, anti the founders. And I do think that they would look down on us if they had the ability to. They would look down on us with shame, with a hanging head. Being a part of something with a statement like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I think it is very important to define those terms as best as we can. Now, when it comes to life, it is expected that it is referring to the right to exist and be protected from harm, including the right to a comfortable and healthy life. With liberty, it is freedom from arbitrary control and the ability to make one's own choices without being forced by the government or having your hand forced for any other reason. And the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, is the most arbitrary one. But What it's suggesting is that one has the right, without infringing on anybody else, without causing harm to anybody else, one has the right to find happiness in any which way that they see fit. That does not mean that they need to pursue being a millionaire, a billionaire. It does not mean that they need to go into any sort of profession to be exact. It does not mean that they need to help out society in certain ways that society may deem is necessary. It means that someone has the right to do which they please, again, so long as they're not infringing on the rights of anybody else and not causing anybody harm. And these things are, I think, if we look back on it, look back on these last 5 to 10 years, especially going through COVID, we saw a pretty massive infringement on those original deemed human and American rights. I mean, that was in the Declaration of Independence. That wasn't even once we got a constitution. That was even before that. So I think it's pretty important looking back to maybe try to get back to a place where we're viewing that terminology as important and coming together as Americans to uphold that ideal and the ability to carry out that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, with the shift of limited government and kind of blowing it up to what we see as the federal bloat that is now, a lot of people have, and I will be one of them as well, to make a connection that you are eroding away at that ability of having liberty and the right to life as it is, or the right to pursue happiness, because a lot of times your hand is forced. It is, I think, in certain ways, I think it's damning. However, I think that the infringement on constitutional rights, the Bill of Rights to be exact, is a little bit more damning. And when I look back on this, I think the attack on free speech, especially with regards to social media, is a big issue. When looking back, and again, I'll reference what happened during COVID, I think so many of us started to see social media platforms as the arbiters of truth, the people who decided what we are allowed to see and what we are not allowed to see. And although it is their right, 100%, they're companies, they're they're not the government, they are not Congress passing laws. When places like Twitter, places like Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, when those places are viewed as the public square, as the area where people are allowed to espouse their ideas, I do think it starts to infringe on maybe not the right itself, but the American way of life and the American values that we're supposedly supposed to hold. The First Amendment, of course, protects free speech from government restriction, does not control companies, and does not tell companies how to run their businesses. So I do think that it's important to point that out. Again, what I'm talking about here is that infringing on the idea, infringing on the thought that people do have a freedom of speech, I think that's the biggest problem. I mean, we saw things like deplatforming, and what has that gone to? You think about people like Alex Jones, who I believe was one of the first major players. Might have been Milo Yiannopoulos, who's first. He was a little bit more fringe to begin with, but you really don't see him at all nowadays. Alex Jones, you'd be it'd be a rare circumstance to see him online nowadays. I believe he is back on Twitter. From what I've seen of him recently, he is not the Alex Jones of before. I don't know whether that is someone is paying his bills. I don't know whether he's being controlled, manipulated, being told what to do. I don't know the truth with that. I'm not going to claim that I know the truth about that. But it has clearly changed him, the attacks that have gone on against him. He is not the guy who was predicting 9/11. He's not the guy who was going into the Bohemian Grove and just exploding the idea that our elite are just like us. He's a very different person nowadays. And a lot of that has to do with what happened to him because of this online censorship. There are countless other examples, my apologies. There are countless other examples of deplatforming and removing people from spaces online in order to create an environment. I guess the goal is to have an Overton window that has shrunk. But the biggest issue with that is, and I think it's quite obvious to us that went through it and that were online in that time, is that it creates massive echo chambers. It really doesn't allow someone who's looking for, maybe not everybody's looking for the truth all the time, but it doesn't allow the ability to have someone put forth an idea that may be counter to what you are always believing, and creating echo chambers where you're constantly hearing what you want to hear or hearing your own side's views on things. When I talk about sides, a lot of times people are thinking about politics, but it could be something as simple as how you feel about certain medical operations or vaccines or free speech or abortion. It could be a number of things. And you are only really being shown the stuff that's going to get you to engage. It is, well, in most cases, actually, that's being shown to you is the things that you would agree with, which I don't think was the real purpose of having free speech. Having free speech was allowing someone to say something that was counter your narrative, and if it didn't make sense or it didn't hold up or there were facts to go against, you combated that with better speech. And instead, what our modern environment has created is an ability to shut down speech if it is not liked. And a lot of times it is demonizing that speech or putting it into the worst possible understanding, the worst possible light in order to get it removed. Now, what a lot of people are experiencing nowadays, there are countless examples of this as well, of people protesting on behalf of Palestinians, especially on college campuses, either being thrown out because they may not be a full-time citizen of the United States, being reprimanded, and being deemed as an anti-Semite because they do not forward the agenda of an Israeli government. And I think it's important with that specific example and many others that you have to point out that you are not anti-Semitic just for calling out the government of Israel. And what they're doing, there has been a bunch of examples of people in Israel and even former prime ministers calling out the Netanyahu regime for carrying out what seems to be a slaughter. And I do want to go back and actually correct something on the record here that I pointed out that I found to be seemingly false. Now, I will caveat this with I have not seen numbers. I have not seen any statistics or bank transfers. I haven't seen anything to back it up. However, I have found multiple quotes and even video of Netanyahu himself saying that he propped up Hamas. And I even made this a hinge point of a whole show where I was trying to dive into the possible malicious intent behind Netanyahu and making sure that he had an opposition in Hamas. And I pointed out as a lie, being a lie in such that it has been proven and even admitted to publicly that the Israeli government had funded organizations that are linked to Hamas, but were before it actually became Hamas. Now, again, I haven't seen bank transfers. I haven't seen any actual data or anybody write up a story that has been, this is how it's been propped up. A lot of it seems to be assumptions being made, and that kind of is what it is. But Netanyahu's own words is that we have to prop up this ideology, these people in Hamas, in order to have a counter narrative, in order to have something to push against. And that has been, to my eyes, to a certain degree, I'm proved wrong. And I'm fine with admitting it. And I would love for it, if I come out and I say things that are wrong, I would love for you guys, if you guys have the information, to please confront me with it. I'm very willing to change my mind with good information. But again, I caveated it and I'll caveat it again. What I just said about Netanyahu and his admittance in at least quoted words and speeches that he has propped up Hamas is only words. Again, I haven't found any bank transfers. A lot of what the assumption is that money was sent through Qatar and by then funneled back into Hamas and Palestine, obviously, or the West Bank, Gaza, no problem. What it seems like also in that situation, not to get too carried away from my total goal of this podcast here, was that it was an operation in order to combat the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now, with that out of the way and my ability to admit that I'm wrong, what a lot of people will say is what I just said is anti-Semitic, because I'm not in support of what Netanyahu is doing, I'm not supportive of what Israel has done. And that's just a way to get back to my point here, is that that's just a way to censor. That's just a way to take down speech and not actually confront the arguments being made. A lot of times people will bring up crime statistics, and when you do so, you're called a racist. A lot of people will bring up statistics about, males in the workforce and call you a sexist, call you a misogynist, when you're just bringing up statistics, bringing up facts. And all of this, in my opinion, but I think that it's pretty well substantiated, all of this is just it's an attempt to censor. It's an attempt to take away someone's ability of free speech. And I do not think that it's correct. Think about how many times we were lied to by the mainstream media in terms of COVID. And anytime you brought up, we being one of them, We The Patriots Podcast, bringing up counter narratives or bringing up the fact that it seems like certain things are wrong, whether you're talking about the masks, whether you're talking about forced injections, anything. When it came to COVID, if you were anti the mainstream narrative, you were a conspiracy theorist. And again, that's just another way to censor. Whether that's being done by a big platform, whether that's being done by mainstream media, I think all of this is just another way for people to try to control the narrative. And I think it's wrong. And I think it's actually counter to the American ideal. Now, what a lot of people will claim is that moderation will prevent harm, misinformation. But at the end of the day, I can't see it, and I could be wrong, and I would like to be challenged on this, although this is much less fact-based and a lot of narrative-based here. But in most cases here, I'm just going to go back to my point that this is just another way to shut down the ability of people to think and the ability of people to say what they feel or say what they may feel is backed up by facts. Censorship at the end of the day weakens the thought of a public square. It erodes at liberty 100%, and it definitely gets away from the idea of unity. If you're not allowed to disagree, everybody needs to be in a utopia of thought. Well, a lot of people just are not going to go along with that just for the fact of going against the grain. And if you can't, again, stand up to your point of view with facts, if you can't back up your thoughts with speech that is defending your point, well, I think there's an issue in your thought process. Now, free speech aside, given that that is the first of our rights built out in the Bill of Rights, I think it's pretty important to pay attention to the first of those words or phrases in that entire phrase of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that's life. Life being defined as the right to exist and being protected from harm. I think one of the most glaring issues in our time is quite obviously the abortion case. Knowing full well that this is very divisive, I have no problem laying out how I actually feel about this issue. First of all, and first and foremost, kind of going back on that free speech thing, it doesn't matter if you're a man, a woman, transgender, non binary. I think you're allowed to have an opinion on anything. I don't think your opinion is invalidated because you are either of those or none of those. But I think it's important that you have some sort of structure or fact basis in order to formulate your opinion, especially if you're going to broadcast it out like I'm doing here. And in doing so, I'm going to take a very divisive stance, I think, on abortion, but I do have good reasons. So let me lay it out here. Given us the understanding of the term life, especially in that phrase of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the right to life, the right to live, the right to not be caused harm is anti-abortion in and of itself. I think it's as simple as that. That's not the only wording that I need to be anti-abortion. But my further point being is that when most of the pro-choice crowd, which is interesting because really they're just pro-abortion, I think it's misnomer. I think it's not properly stated. However, when most of that crowd, the pro-abortion crowd, pro-choice crowd, when they're making their arguments, it's always on behalf of the woman, that the woman's life is affected, which is true. They're saying that she should have the right to choose to follow her own path of happiness, whatever her pursuit of happiness may be, and that having this baby may get in the way of her pursuing her happiness. Now, it's very interesting to me that many of the arguments made on behalf of the baby in the womb, the unborn child, are all made on the pro-life side. I think that when you're talking about the right to life, the right to avoid undue harm, I think that that's where the entire argument is made. I remember seeing a video, I want to say when I was something like 18, 19 years old, that was an abortion doctor, someone I assume that worked at something like a Planned Parenthood, might have just been in a hospital, clinic, but they were explaining in front of Congress and being questioned about what goes on in an abortion. And as they laid out the technicalities, the everyday life, day in, day out life of a doctor performing abortions, it was very clear that this procedure is not done in a clean manner at any stage. Not at 3 weeks, not at 8 weeks, not at 20, not at 40, most certainly, and definitely not closer to birth. It is a very dirty practice, so to speak. And I don't mean that in the sense that they're doing something that is not a medical operation. It's not done to standards. It absolutely is. The point being is that it is clear that a life is being taken. And I encourage you to go look up these videos. I don't feel like paraphrasing them again. I probably haven't seen this video in at least 5 years. But the entire argument, really, I think that should be made against abortion is that it is wrong. It is against our founding principles, realistically. And outside of the cases, which are the extreme cases that are also a huge hinge argument for the pro-choice, pro-abortion crowd, outside of those, which is rape, incest, and I think another one that should be considered, although it's a little bit different of an argument, but I do think that the outlier cases should also include teen pregnancy. So when you take those instances out and you're arguing on behalf of what is the majority of abortions that are performed in the United States, I think that as a country, we need to get back to having a standard and promoting that life, even if it's possible that the mother can't take care of the child, even if it's possible that the family unit that is producing the child can't take care of it. There are a lot of social structures and societal structures and cultural structures that have been built up to a point where that child can be taken care of after birth, even if it is not by the birthing parents. Now, is orphanhood, is that a great place to be? Is living under parents that are not your biological parents the best situation for someone? No. But I think the broader point being made, and especially mine being made, is that that person who is unborn would be better off being born than being aborted, being killed. And I do think it does go as far as being killed, especially if you are to listen to kind of like what I just pointed out as that video of the doctor being questioned in front of Congress, and many, many more. There are tons of doctors who have gotten out of the field because of the guilt that they feel. There are tons of examples of women who regret their decision to have an abortion, and I think that they should all be listened to. Now, are there cases of the opposite? Absolutely. And again, what I'm trying to argue is kind of my point of view here, and coalescing all of this information and all of these transgressions against the founding fathers, the founding principles of our nation, and where I see the issue. And another big part of this issue that really doesn't get talked about a ton is the massive decline in birth rate. Now, I think maybe not a lot of people, but most people who may have taken a class called Human Geography Studies, it was an AP course. I think I took it when I was a junior in high school. But in this class, and I think a lot of people know the answer to this, but there is a definitive answer as to how many children need to be born per woman in order to keep a society going in terms of replacing its citizenry without needing any buffs from immigration. And that number is 2.1. And why is it 2.1? Well, it can't be 2.0 because you would assume that it would be very close in terms of women and men in the population, very close to 50-50. But that's actually not the answer. The answer is not that there's more women in the society than men. No, the answer is that there are a certain amount of women who are born unable to have a child. There are a certain amount of women who may refuse to have babies. And when you're looking at trying to keep up with the replacement rate, it needs to be at least 2.1 children per woman. This is really one of the biggest reasons I think that abortion has hurt the United States, especially in the long run. It's not that I'm anti-immigration. I actually think immigration is fantastic for the country, especially in terms of blending in different types of people, getting the best of different nations and pulling together just a coalition of great human beings. That's what America is supposed to be. However, being in a position where you need to rely on immigration in order to keep up with the demands of, we'll say, an economy, being able to keep up with filling out and having a stable job placing, right? Having the production numbers that we see that are so high in our nation. This is not a healthy place to be, I don't think. And so as you look at the birth rate in pre-Roe versus Wade numbers, you actually see that our birth rate in 1960, which is about 15 years or so, give or take, about 13 to be exact, 3.65 births per woman was the rate in 1960. And then when you go all the way out to 2023, it's actually at a rate of about 1.61, actually less than half in terms of the births. And Roe versus Wade was actually, went against in 2022. So it was all the way up until that time that we've had this law that essentially gave a federal right to an abortion to women. And it's, I think, looking at those numbers specifically at births per woman, but also thinking about, again, looking back on what we used to classify as a right, that right to life, it's gone against that value as well. And I just think that it's not really upholding what not just our founders, but what Americans for generations felt was an obligation to the next generation, obligation to raise children. And in a way, it's also, and notice I haven't made a religious argument here for abortion, but I do think that religion does come into play when we're talking about all of the issues that I'm talking about today. There are not really many people in this country now, in this day and age, that actually hold their religious values close. And a lot of what religious values, if you are to uphold them in your daily life, they give you a grounding principle. And I think that that's also another pretty large issue with having certain principles or certain values that you hold high, where we just don't really have those. A lot of people are living their lives, and not to say in any way, shape, or form that most Americans align with Donald Trump, but I think a lot of them live like Donald Trump, where you're kind of going with the flow. You're kind of feeling out where you should be, reading the room, trying to win the votes over, win the people over that are in your midst, and not really grounding themselves and not really finding something to stand on. Not to say that you should be dying on any hills, but metaphorically speaking, maybe you should be in order to get out the message that you are trying to stand on. I think being wishy-washy or being in a position where you're just trying to feel out the crowd, I think it's just not helping, if I'm being completely honest. And when it comes to, of course, the pro-abortion arguments, I made a few, but a lot of them too are coming at it as either anti-religious. A lot of them actually, if you are talking on the behalf of the Jewish population, as it has been found by me, and I could be wrong, but it seems to me that life under Jewish practices does not begin until the birth itself, not at conception. And if that's true, then that's a very solid argument for abortion, to be fair. Do I agree with it? Again, I think it really does not hold up. I think that most people who find out the underlying truths about abortion are a little bit appalled. And I think that as well, kind of go back on something that I was saying earlier. Just because you're a man, or just because you're not a part of the female group, just because you can't have an abortion, that doesn't mean you can't have an opinion on it. That'd be like saying that you can't have an opinion on rape. Where I think I'm pretty fair in saying that everybody who has a solid state of mind understands that rape is disgusting, no matter who commits it, no matter who it happens to. It's a disgusting act, and we should all condemn it. And I think that as a nation, as a society, and a culture, I think that we need to be more anti-abortion, recognizing too that there's probably no way to have zero abortion. I'll take that as a fair argument and maybe a political argument. How I feel morally, I think it's wrong. But politically, I think we need to agree that there needs to be a pretty early cutoff. Definitely see a reduction. There are many people that make the argument again that they're incapable of taking care of a child in their current status, and I think that just couldn't be further from the truth. I think so many people, you hear the allegedly dire situation that they were born into, and yet their parents turned out fine. They turned out fine. And I think that as a nation, we could do a much better job too at helping these people out. And I do think at the end of the day, I think a lot of that comes down to as well what kind of community that you have. What kind of family do you have? Do you have a supportive family? Do you have a supportive community to go to? Even if it's not your surrounding neighbors, but maybe it's a religious community, maybe it's somewhere where you are going and being in a group of other young parents, something like this. I think it's very important. I think it's extremely important. I think that it goes, again, being as pro-abortion as we have been as a country, and believe, I could be wrong in this assumption, but I believe we've had the most amount of abortions out of any of the advanced nations, any nations, realistically. I think that that is a bad thing. I do not think that's a good thing. Now, this next right that I want to talk about is not an enshrined right. And to be fair, Roe versus Wade was a later addition. It was not a right that was held by any of our founders. But this one is not exactly enshrined, and I'll tell you what I mean here. The right to privacy. There's no exact amendment that necessarily says that you have the right to privacy. Now, there are, of course, the no quarters amendment. There are the amendment of you need to have a fair trial and trial by your peers. You can't have an unreasonable search. But a lot of these are kind of implications, and they've been interpreted in many different ways over the different eras that we've lived here in the United States. And I think it's definitely something that is fluid. And I do not think that you remember when people were having the arguments over the Supreme Court justices years ago, and they were saying, the liberal judges see this as a living document, whereas the conservative judges see it as a document in and of itself that is the document you're supposed to be interpreting. I think that this right to privacy is very much the same, and President Trump actually recently brought this into the fold. I don't know if anybody was paying attention as this kind of rolled out. It seemed like it was going under the radar, so to speak, with very, very major journalist by the name of Glenn Greenwald had a massive scandal this weekend. And at the same time, being released was the fact that the United States is doing a deal with a company named Palantir. I apologize, Palantir. Now, what Palantir is essentially a massive database aggregator and an AI platform that can aggregate personal data and use AI in order to do really what you want with it. You're basically telling it to find outliers. You're telling it to sift the records and look for inconsistencies, all this different stuff. But at the end of the day, what it seems to me, and I'll hopefully be able to read more on it, they seem a little sketchy and that they don't want to have Palantir, to be fair, to be completely exact. They don't really seem like they want to have all of their information out, which kind of makes sense because they seem very sketchy. But from what I can tell, it seems like it's a massive expansion on the surveillance state. And I think a lot of Americans had a very, very good point to bring up, especially after the Patriot Act and in its expansion and with technology and the NSA and their ability to get phone records, tap phones, all of this different stuff that has really affected really the average American, unfortunately. This aggregation of data and this company that's now being essentially subcontracted by our federal government in order to sift through all this data and find outliers again, it's a massive encroachment on privacy in the United States. And it's making us seem a lot closer to something like that. I do not think that this is a true reality, but what a lot of people would have termed that surveillance state that existed in China with the social credit score, with making sure you're following their rules or you get punished. I think that we're heading in that direction, and I think this is just the next step. A question that I would like to pose to all my listeners and anybody who may think along the same lines is, well, you may be okay with it if Trump is running the government, or you might not be. But how would you feel if the shoe was on the other foot? Would you feel the same if Palantir was being run by Biden or being run by a Kamala Harris administration? Would you feel the same if it was a Gavin Newsom administration or a JD Vance administration? The honest answer for me is it doesn't matter who it is. I'm not comfortable with this whatsoever. What it seems like this is going to be is they're going to partner up with agencies like the DHS, ICE, the NSA, and they're going to be tracking Americans. Now, putting all of this together, and obviously we have major, major banks in the United States that can tie into this as well. It seems like it is just going to be putting all of us Americans as a number in a system and watching us, making sure that our numbers are matching up. Maybe for tax reasons, it may be for watching us, maybe for trying to predict crime, whatever it may be. I'm of the opinion that it's a pretty big invasion of privacy. A lot of the arguments going back on the abortion thing, a lot of the arguments for abortion being legal is that it's a privacy issue and that the mother has the right to do as she pleases with her body. Well, this whole setup with the surveillance state is allowing nobody to do what they want at all with not just their body, but their decision-making ability. And if it goes through, and again, I think if the wrong person gets their hands on it, you may think, I'm not so sure how to feel about this, I'm a little iffy, but you may think that Trump is not going to violate this or use this to go against Americans. He may just be using it for deportees, yada, yada, yada. I'm honestly not in full agreement with that. I think that this could easily be abused by anybody who gets it. But I also think that if this gets into the hands of someone who's really purely evil and has maniacal aspirations, we could be looking at some very scary times coming forward. Again, I urge you to think back as well on the free speech conversation and just how non-free all platforms were during COVID, and even just during the Biden administration generally. It's a scary thought that we're just going to now aggregate everything that may be making up an online presence and put you in a database for it. I think it's something that we need to think about. And is this really what we voted for as a country? At the end of the day, you are going against that second phrase in that lovely statement of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Liberty is absolutely being infringed upon here, and I do not think that most Americans are okay with it going further than we already have it. I think most people feel like we're already surveyed enough. As an example, I got a speeding ticket from a robot out in Pennsylvania about 3 or 4 months ago. Thankfully, it was taken back, but even just the principle and the fact that they were able to do that, no confrontation, I got no warning, I got no cop coming to my door, just a letter in the mail that I was speeding and caught by a robot camera. That's pretty disgusting in and of itself. Now think about this on a grand scale, and everything you're doing is watching, or everything that you post online is aggregated, or every video, like the ones that I make for you guys, is aggregated into a database. And if I'm not saying the right thing, if you're not saying the right thing, your dad's not saying the right thing, maybe not. They'll end up in jail, or maybe possibly more significantly, their ability to do business with banks is infringed upon, which we've seen the banks be weaponized under the last about 10 to 15 years. We've seen platforms go against, we've seen people destroy lives strictly using online systems all over the place for the past 15 to 20 years. And it is scary, very scary to look at. And I think at the end of the day, all of these things that I've brought up today are going at one of those fundamental values, which is liberty. I do think that liberty, we say it in our Pledge of Allegiance, liberty and justice for all. This is not liberty, and this is not justice. Going against the First Amendment, going against possibly the Fourth Amendment, going against the right to life, going against the right to have a small government. We've gone against all of these things, and I think America is paying for it. I think you see it with the really surging debt crisis that we have and nobody really wants to talk about. I think we also see it in the fact that there really is no such thing as an American value anymore. Even something as simple as hard work is just not really seemingly valued at the same way that it was when I was a child. And that's a scary thought. Used to be the thought that you go in, you put your head down, you get to work and you do your thing well. You're going to be compensated fantastically for it, and you may end up taking yourself up another rung in society from where you were born. And now it could be something as simple as a woman flashing her boobs at the right time online and gets paid for life. It could be something as simple as a guy going viral for having a catastrophic injury, but he does it in a way that's comical or does it in a way that catches views. And they're set for life because of the amount of views they got online. And instead of someone working extremely hard and getting somewhere, you're seeing people take advantage of virality and the internet. And I think in ways that really, really do go against the moral fiber of the nation, go against what this nation was built on. You think about the war that had to be waged upon Great Britain in order to separate what started realistically as a civil war and ended up as a revolution. It's some crazy, crazy thought to think that, well, we now, I don't think that we could come together on one issue even close to as big as that, because there would be so much division. There would be really, I think the biggest issue here is that there's really no core value. There's no core principles that would lead us to the same destination, whether we disagreed or agreed on a lot of other things, right? We can't even get together and agree that we're getting taxed too much. You think about what we started that war over, like a 2% tax on tea or something like that. It's blasphemous. I think that it really does kind of indict us as Americans, and I hope that at some point soon there's somewhat of a wake up call to really step out of what is the norm today and think about how we can come together, how we can start to maybe redevelop some of these values. And I think obviously a lot of it has to do with education at the end of the day. But can we get back to a core set of values that actually sets us up for a brighter future? I think a very big aspect of that, of course, is going to be cutting government spending, getting rid of the people that waste our money. I read that there's somewhere over 2 million people that work for the federal government. Why? Just why? At the end of the day, the federal government, what it was supposed to be But when it started was the president and his cabinet. And now that's expanded to multiple alphabet letter agencies, a whole bunch of non-government organizations. There's a whole bunch of which work in hand with the government. A lot of them, of course, to work with something like a CIA to get operations that they may not want, right? So at the end of the day, a lot of these operations, that federal government number of 2.1 million could be very misleading with the amount of business that's actually being done by federal contractors, non-government organizations, and a whole slew of other ways that the government is involved in our day-to-day life. And I think it'd be important. I think it's imperative actually on us as Americans to get away from that, cut down the size of government, really get them out of our daily lives. And at the end of the day, what they would probably take them away from, federally at least, would be something like an abortion. Get them out of the ability to control our speech. How many deals does Google, obviously the platform that runs YouTube, how many deals does Google have with the government in order to possibly control or curtail our speech? How many deals does Facebook have? Facebook, Meta. How many deals does Twitter, X, Elon Musk have? We all know it's a lot. At the back of our heads, I hope at least, we all know there's a ton of government money flowing into these online spaces at the end of the day that are really getting in the way of our daily lives. Censorship is really terrible, I think. The amount of just inability to confront bad information and striking them down, I think it really does take away at the fabric of our First Amendment right of having the freedom of speech. Having the freedom of speech comes with the danger that there's going to be people utilizing that for bad things. That's on us as the American people to combat that, to come at it with really great things to say. And I think you look back on something like abortion. I may have said something that struck a nerve to you. Feel free to reach out to me, but understand the whole reason that I bring up that point is that it does go against one of the really core sayings from even before our Constitution, the act of abortion or propping it up. And I'm not talking about the outlier cases. I'm not talking about teen pregnancy. I'm talking about the cases where someone is physically fine, physically an adult, and is still deciding that they're incapable of carrying a baby to term that they themselves made the decision to have the ability to have. At the end of the day, even if you're using contraception, you are running a risk of having a child. And if you're not taking that risk, maybe you shouldn't be having sex in the first place, rather than going and ending a life prematurely before it even has a chance to get up into the earth. To me, I think again, I kind of go back on this life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness thing, and I think that it's such a beautiful saying, as old as it may be, and it's been constructed in a few different ways in different governments. I know in Britain it's been different, but you talk about the United States and just how core that was, the central message to driving people in order to unite under one banner in order to fight an overarching force. And now I think we've become the overarching force. Being unable to stop this runaway gravy train, I think, is going to come back and bite us a lot sooner than we're thinking. And my best hope is that we as Americans get together and can do that stopping. That's about all I have for today. I hope that you enjoyed it. Going to be having a pretty special Substack show coming out. I'm thinking it's going to be in about 2 weeks now. So it should be around the middle of June, somewhere around there. That's going to be on the 9/11 attacks. Now it's going to be, for sure, I've found out at this point, a multi-part series, multiple hours, lots and lots of research going into it. So if you wouldn't mind, subscribe to this if you're not already, whether you are on a platform like Spotify, Apple Music, or whether you are on YouTube especially. Subscribe to this platform, follow our weekly uploads, but also go head over to our Substack. That's at, I believe it's We The Patriots Substack. It'll be in link in the description. Go check us out over there. Check us out on whatever page that you're on. Go see whatever videos you might be interested in. And, at this point, we have well over 100 episodes of pretty good content at the end of the day. And if you don't like it, don't be afraid to share your opinion. I want to hear all your opinions down below, whether it has to do with freedom of speech, the size of government, abortion itself, or this new surveillance state that's going to be monitored by Trump. With all that said, hope you have a beautiful week, and I will catch you in the next one.
I wish I were the fucking state. I want to be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.